An Army National Guard helicopter was in the small town of Milford this afternoon.
It was part of the solution to keeping the Maine State Police and 2 area radio stations on the air. I was there as the chopper carried off its cargo.
1 week after Maine was hit with an ice storm many of us will never forget, people are fighting to keep generators running. The state police in Orono use radio equipment on top of Passadumkeag Mountain that relies on a propane-powered generator. Also on the mountain sits transmitting equipment for WHCF and WVOM radio stations. It's because of the state police mountaintop equipment that an army of volunteers put together 2 nets full of propane bottles destined for the transmitter. An Army National Guard helicopter sat in the Milford Snowmobile Club parking lot, prepared to lift off with the cargo. The chopper with Steve Buzzell, Ron Ireland, Steve Curtis, and Tony Jans on board lifted off without a problem and made it to the mountaintop. The trip with the second batch of bottles wasn't as successful.
After I left, the Army National Guard chopper was forced to drop that second shipment of 22 tanks of fuel from the air. The 4 crew members hit turbulence, forcing them to dump the tanks to stabilize the swaying helicopter. Spike Moffitt watched from the Snowmobile Club in Milford.
I noticed a definite difference between this load and the first load. That the load was starting to act like a pendulum. And the further he went, the worse it was getting. In fact, he didn't fly in the same direction. He's flying sideways. And it looked like he was having trouble controlling the load. I mean, he did one heck of a job.
The tanks were dropped in an unoccupied area. No one was hurt. The Army National Guard says the fuel will be recovered tomorrow. Bob Randall from the Department of Environmental Protection says the fuel does not pose a threat. He says the tanks are sturdy and can take quite a pounding. Maine's congressional delegation has been busy finding federal money to pay for the ice storm cleanup. Not only have they been in contact with Washington, they are also traveling throughout the state. Senator Susan Collins joins us in the newsroom now. Senator, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule for us.
I'm glad to be here, Dale.
We just received news from your office about 5 minutes ago that the new estimates are out. CMP and Bangor Hydro have incurred about $30 million cleaning up the mess after this ice storm. And there is a housing and urban development program that may help with some of the costs. Is that true? That's
right, Dale. We've been exploring since yesterday whether there is any source of federal funds that would help defray that $30 million in additional costs that the utilities have incurred in the cleanup and the repair from this storm. It appears that last year a Midwestern utility did receive some CBDG funds, some community development block grant funds from HUD to try to defray some of the costs. So we're looking at that very closely. I'm going to be contacting the Secretary of HUD, Andrew Cuomo, to explore that option. It's the first breakthrough. It's the first time that we've been able to identify even a possible source of funds.
How soon till we know?
Well, we've just literally discovered this within the last hour or so, so I don't want to put a timetable on it, but we're going to be doing everything we can to see if this is a possible source. As I said, it appears there was precedent for using this program in last year's floods in the Midwest, so I am hopeful that we will be able to successfully explore this option.
We'll definitely keep in touch with you on that. One other thing I'd like to talk about is what you're launching. You call it Operation Information. Your staff goes to town offices to give people information on finding financial help from the governor, from the federal government. What kind of help is available at this point?
Well, right now, as you know, the President has declared Maine a major disaster area. That sets in motion help for up to 75% of the costs for communities. So one of the things that we're doing is I'm sending out my staff throughout the state. Some of the Bangor staff is going to Washington County tomorrow to visit municipal offices and to hold office hours. Another source of help is in the food stamp program. As I've talked to people in shelters, this has come up over and over. People who have food stamps and use them to buy food that's spoiled because of the storm are eligible to have new food stamps issued. So that's the kind of information that my staff is going to be making an all-out effort to get out by going throughout the state tomorrow.
We're running short on time, Senator, but quickly, what are the eligibility requirements for federal assistance for people?
The individual assistance program has not yet been approved, but assuming that it is approved, low-income people who do not have insurance and other resources are eligible for low-interest loans and up to $13,000 in grants in some limited circumstances. That's what John Baldacci and I are going to be lobbying the Vice President for approval of that part of the program tomorrow. The individual eligibility requirements vary greatly, and the best bet once that program is approved is for people to call the 1-800 number that FEMA will be establishing by the end of the week.
Senator Susan Collins, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thanks very much.
On every street corner and in every yard, the story seems to be the same. Mother Nature can sure leave a mess behind.
Terrible, terrible. All these branches and trees down, it's awful. It's going to take quite a job to pick it up.
Waterville took it on the chin during Ice Storm 98. For some, it has been decades since they've seen anything this bad.
Never anticipated anything like this. I was here during the hurricane back in the 80s, and it didn't create half the problem this has done.
Power outages are widespread around Waterville, so to ease the burden, the Red Cross has set up an emergency shelter at Colby College's field house. Waterville public work crews have been working 18-hour days to clear brush from streets and sidewalks, and the director says those long days will continue. He says it will be March by the time the city gets back on their feet.
Anyway, with the wires down and getting the streets back to normal, the sidewalks, God, we're going to be well into March before we see our sidewalks again. We've still got 1.5 feet, 2 feet of ice on top of them.
More than 1,100 soldiers in the National Guard are on active duty as Maine thaws out from the ice storm.
Bankers, lawyers, and teachers have left their 9-to-5s behind to answer the Pine Tree State's emergency call. But the Attorney General's office fears not all employers are allowing their National Guard employees to do their duty. Channel 7's Patrick James tells us interfering with Guard duty is a crime with serious consequences.
Unless you just crawled out of a cave, this is a pretty familiar scene. Work crews going the extra mile to put Maine back online. But what you're really looking at here are bankers, lawyers, and teachers answering the call.
These guys have been doing this in this area around, outside the outlying areas of Bangor since Friday and Saturday.
Sean Harmon is a machinist who fully expects to return to his job when the crisis is over without any repercussions for his leaving. In fact, that's a right protected by law.
I talked to my employer last night, told them we were extended, and he said, that's fine, just do what you got to do, and go ahead and don't worry about it. They're quite supportive of that.
The Attorney General's office says by and large most employers have been very cooperative. It's the handful that may not be cooperative that they're worried about.
Some of the soldiers where they don't have a full-time job, maybe they're working seasonally as working in the woods or at a ski resort or something. Some of them have had some concerns about whether or not they're going to be able to get back to work and get their feet on the ground when they come back. On Friday, when we were initially alerted to do this, we had to call people, and we were actually calling them at work, at their place of work, and having to talk to employers and bringing them in. Employers being very supportive, knowing that the soldiers were in the Guard, and this is really what their focus is in case of an emergency like this.
Penalizing a National Guard employee is a Class E crime. And for these guys, their only request is to go from disaster relief back to their 9-to-5. In Otis, Patrick James, Channel 7 News.